Okay, well, thanks so much, Kim. And thank you, everybody. I'm excited to be here and for this opportunity to share the research I'm engaged in. So there are a number of titles this presentation could give. On the broadest level, my main interest is studying the balance of nature. And then you step that down, ecological significance of body size and aquatic food webs. So we'll talk about aquatic organisms don't have arms and claws like terrestrial organisms. So basically they eat what fits in their mouth. And so that allows for or promotes size structured feeding relationships. So body size is almost more important than species identity in aquatic food webs. And finally, this is all going towards a size-based food web approach to fisheries management. So the learning goals I'm hoping you walk away with today is first to gain an appreciation for the complexity of aquatic food webs, but also that there's an intuitive simplicity about them. So we'll compare and contrast the complex with the simple. Then demonstrate the interdependence. Sorry, I wanted to start. The interdependence of physics, chemistry, biology, physiology, history, mathematics, and cultural diversity within the scope of aquatic ecology. If anyone remembers the sitcom Married with Children, you can't have one without the other. All right, all of these disciplines form the basis of aquatic ecology. And finally, introduce you to the developing body size-based food web approach to fisheries management. As you're likely aware, current fisheries management is really on a species by species basis. You know, we want more brook trout, we want more largemouth bass, we don't want these carp, right? And that kind of management is devoid of the greater principles of physics and the early origins of ecology. And so we'll talk a little bit about that history. So kind of the highlights or the table of contents, if you will. I'm going to start with just one slide to quickly talk about the abridged version of my story, right? Talk about the importance of you all. And then we'll get to the main content, ecological pyramids, which I believe you're all familiar with and teach in middle school and high school. So that's one of my main interests. That segues into community size structure. That's about half of the whole presentation. Then I'll rapidly go through two examples of applying the community size structure and then end with a one slide overview of conclusions and synthesis. If there's time, I did a really cool diversity exercise in my ichthyology class last fall. I'll share that, but we may not get to that. And just a blue catfish, just because. This was actually caught maybe 2-3 weeks ago in the Kanawha River near the mouth of the Ohio River. One of the graduate students at WVU I'm working with, this is part of his project. Gratuitous fish picture. Okay, so before I get into like a quick thing of my story, I want to share with you all respect and admiration I have for you all. Being middle school and high school teachers. Our society, of course, is on the cusp of more and more problems, and the only way we're going to solve those problems of today and of tomorrow is you guys preparing the next generation of adults. So I thank you for the work that you do there. Second, my daughter's here in middle school in Morgantown, doing great. We love all of her teachers. It's a fantastic program, so really thankful for that. So anyway, I guess part of giving this presentation is an appreciation for what you all do. And finally, when you guys do a good job, it makes my job easier and more fun. When students arrive here and have a good handle on mathematics, can write effectively, can communicate effectively, I'm able to do really cool things, advanced things with the students. When I have to go back and help them with basic algebra or develop a paragraph, it just gets in the way and we can't get to the really cool cutting edge stuff. So anyway, when you guys do a good job, it helps us a lot. And allows me to do a better job. So again, thank you. So just real quick, kind of a perspective of where I come from. I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania during the 70s and 80s. You know, family weekend adventures. We were always hiking, bird watching, and fishing. And you know, in middle school, I had to deal with bullies a lot. So back then it was a little bit different. The solution was you go join karate, you learn how to fend for yourself. Well, you take the love of nature and you mix it with some of that Eastern philosophy, and you just think about the balance of nature. And that has actually churned through, you know, a program up at California, Pennsylvania, just north of here, in wildlife biology, and master's east of here in Frostburg, Maryland, in applied ecology, conservation biology. And then I went up to Syracuse, New York at the College of Environmental Science and Forestry for my PhD. But that the Eastern philosophy and the love of nature kind of combined, and I ended up working with fish, and it's been a beautiful fit. After my doctoral work, I spent 6-7 years in Michigan working on Great Lakes food web work with Central Michigan University. Then I joined U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where I spent the last 7-8 years in San Juan, Puerto Rico, doing landscape scale conservation. So I joined WU just about 5 months ago in August, but it seems to be a good fit so far. Okay, so with that brief introduction, I want to get into the main topic, right? So food webs, right? One of the best ways to perceive a food web is through this classic Eltonian pyramid, or food pyramid, ecological pyramid. It has lots of names, and I'm fairly certain you all start teaching and introducing students to this in middle school and again in high school. And so you may be aware of some of the history with this. The pyramid was originally conceived by Charles Sutherland and Elton in a book called Animal Ecology, 1927. And, you know, that wasn't a standalone. He didn't come up with these ideas. He was built on his predecessors, of course, Charles Darwin. And at the same time, Darwin, there was this guy, George Wallace. And they independently came up with the ideas of Darwin, put into the book. Origin of Species, where I talk about natural selection. And inherent in that discussion was basically the underlying premise that there's a limited amount of energy available in the food web. And so there's competition. And the individuals and the species that are best adapted to conditions, they will survive and do better, passing on those traits to the next generation. And, you know, Elton took those ideas and combine it with the laws of thermodynamics, right? There's only first law of thermodynamics, there's only so much energy available in a system, and that each time that energy changes form, you lose a certain proportion of it through entropy, right? And so Elton conceptualized that into this trophic pyramid. And so this really appealed to me because of the balance, the structure of nature. Raymond Lindemann in 1942 developed it even further in a lake system, the trophic dynamic aspect of ecology. And then we'll get into the 1980s. These guys, Kitchell, who's long since retired, and Stewart here was my mentor in my doctoral program and postdoc. And we did bioenergetics. So bioenergetics looks at the energy intake, and we'll talk about it in the next slide, but the energy intake and dynamics of the growth of one individual. You can apply that to a population. And eventually, Daniel Pauly applied that individual-based energetics to a whole food web with extraordinary complexity. And so when we talk about integrating among the sciences, right, here's history. We could spend an entire class period talking about how scientists build, how science builds from one theory to the next and the next, and how all the current leaders in science are standing on the shoulders of all these amazing people before. We can also talk a little bit about cultural diversity. So with the exception of Daniel Pauly, our field and most of the folks from history all tend to be a lot of white males from England, moved to the, like Darwin and Wallace came from England. A lot of these other were American scientists. Daniel Pauly's Canadian and Black. So like to point that out. Just there's a growing cultural diversity. Right now, my classroom that I teach in is 50-50. Any given class can be more women, more guys. It fluctuates, but darn near 50-50, and that's a wonderful thing to see. I feel like we still have an underrepresentation of minorities, but we need to continue working on that. So relative to this history lesson, I think it's really cool to think about the state of the world during each of these time periods, right? Charles Darwin and George Wallace, when they were working, that was about the time period of the American Revolution, right? So there's gunpowder and horse and buggy, right? During the time of Elton, that was around the time of the Great Depression, you know, but the first cars were out on the roads, right? What was technology like? What was the relationship that society had with nature? How did that change over the last 150 years, right? And then we think about tools and technology. We go from gunpowder to here, Kitchell and Stewart. Don Stewart would tell us when they were doing these original bioenergetics works, they had to put punch cards into the machines to run them, right? Well, now Daniel Pauly, when he was doing his work with EcoPath EcoSim, he had desktop computers. So the technology is amazing. We can talk about all of that, the history meeting with science and advancement. So just a moment on this bioenergetics. Bioenergetics, again, this is basically algebra, but it's of growth, right? And so we have G, which is growth, equals, now we're going to get a mass balance here. Consumption is a C minus, now everything in that parentheses is basically metabolism, but we can break it into pieces. R is respiration. SDA stands for specific dynamic action. This is actually the body's, the physiology of digesting the food, transporting the energy throughout the body. F and U, not to be used together. That represents egestion and excretion, so waste, right? All metabolic processes have waste. And then P is production of gametes, and particularly for female fish, sometimes, generally like, 10 to 40% of their energy goes towards gametes. But for some species, that's as much as 70% of their energy intake goes to creating eggs. And so what we see is this mass balance consumption, the other fish that you eat, right, minus all the costs of metabolism. What's left goes into body growth, right? How quickly you can reach size. And fish are indeterminate growers, which means they never stop growing. They never reach a fixed adult size like birds and mammals do. Well, all of those letters there have, oftentimes 2 to 8 other equations that you need to solve to calculate that value. And they're all a function of temperature because they're cold-blooded. Their metabolism changes with temperature. And then it interacts with body size because we know across all organisms, whether cold-blooded or warm-blooded, metabolism scales to body temperature at a negative exponential rate, -3/4 power, generally, give or take. But across all organisms, that's the scheme. And so, what I did with this presentation was basically like, this would be like an ideal aquatic ecology course that links history, all these fields, right? History, physics, limnology, and chemistry, and puts them all together. But each of these slides could be 1 or more days of the lecture or lab. This would be a great lab to do in Excel. So anyway, that's how you look at the growth of an individual, but then population growth is basically the sum of all those individuals across ages, because age and body size are highly correlated. And then you subtract out the deaths. And so this is what Stewart, my advisor, was doing back in the 80s. Then come the 90s and into the 2000s, Daniel Pauly. Daniel Pauly also, you may have heard of the term fishing down the food web. That's Daniel Pauly. He recognized that, from the 1960s to present day, what comes off those fishing boats and into our grocery stores keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller because we've over harvested all the large fish in a systemic sort of way. And so we're fishing down the food web. The food web is actually shrinking. So that was Daniel Pauly's, one of his biggest contributions. But he also developed this simulation model. And looking at a food web, this shows the just mind-boggling complexity of all these organisms feeding off each other, energy flowing everywhere. And so for where each of those lines are is a set of those equations for all of the individuals across all the ages for each of those species or species groups, right? So this was not possible until the advent of computers. These are extremely data-rich. These would take hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars, 5 to 10, 15 years to collect all the field data in order to run a model like this. So this is used for research purposes. This is impractical for management. You can't do this everywhere. So what we need is a system that is more simplistic, but captures all of this. And so what scientists in the marine systems, especially England and the European Union have done a lot with this work, is basically transforming Elkman's pyramid, which is based on laws of thermodynamics, into this line. So if we take a look at part of the community of interest, the fish assemblage, we divide them up by size classes. As we said, big things eat smaller things, and they eat smaller things yet, right? And so we see this size-structured feeding relationship. So we break it into size classes, and we plot size class on the x-intercept and their abundance, the abundance of each size class on the y-intercept, and across all systems, except systems that are highly disturbed. But the oceans, bays, like large rivers, ponds, lakes, reservoirs, they all basically adhere to this pattern that you log because it's a negative exponential curve, but you log transform and you get a straight line, y equals mx plus b. Now the slope can vary over time, it wiggles, right? If there's a huge year class of, say, yellow perch are born, that will bump this side up. Or if the largemouth bass are overfished, the large fish down here at this end, that'll cause that to drop. And eventually over time, it's going to equalize again. So it wobbles. And then that y-intercept also has biological meaning. So we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. But this boils down to a simple y equals mx plus b. And it captures all of that complexity, but we're looking at the distribution of individuals among size classes, not species. We can always look at species secondarily. And importantly, the two primary factors driving food web structure is competition, which happens within size classes, similar size fish competing over the same resources, and predation. So larger fish eating the smaller fish. Okay, in these next two slides, I want to celebrate two of the leading women in the field, Julia Blanchard. This graph is from one of her papers. Trends in Ecology and Evolution. It's one of the most esteemed scientific journals in our field. But she put this together, a size spectra of different groups of organisms collectively put together form one big size spectra. And so there's a lot of plankton, right? Less squid and smaller fishes, sharks, whales, their abundance decreases, just like the Eltonian pyramid. However, this we can gauge biological meaning from. So the elevation, or that y-intercept, right? And y equals mx plus b, the b term, is an index of ecological capacity, or the size of the food web. And that changes depending on nutrients in the system, subsidies from other food webs, etc. And then the slope, right? Y equals mx, the m term, right, is a ratio of large to small individuals. That measures ecological efficiency. How much of the biomass in plankton is turned into small fish? How much of the biomass of small fish is turned into larger fish? It's pretty simple, but this encapsulates all that complexity from the EcoPath EcoSim, and this we can do with very basic monitoring data that all agencies do. So it's very intuitive and it's simple. So what this, as I said, this summarizes the complexity of food webs into a digestible framework. And so what I'm trying to do in my lab is translate what's really been a marine tool and turn it into inland freshwater tool. And there's another woman I hugely respect. I've only had email correspondence with her. I think she's either Portuguese or from Belgium, but she's been working in Spain for the last several years, but she's one of the leaders in community size spectrum work. So growing diversity in the field is just a wonderful thing. Okay, so how do we translate this into usable management? Well, here's fish community objectives from Lake Ontario, right? And so the objectives of the US and the United States and Canada, the provinces and states around Lake Ontario, basically, if you look at these, and this exists for all of these species and then more, is maintain growth and condition above, right? We see increase, increase, increase. All of these fish community objectives for all the species, they want to make more of them. There's a limit to the food web, though. You can't increase all the species. Basically, as community size factor shows, if you increase the abundance of one species, one or more other species have to decrease because there's only a limited amount of energy. And we knew this, Elton knew this in 1927. Somehow the field has drifted away from it. And so working to ground ecology back into those basic principles again. So it looks like I've got maybe 5 to 8 minutes left. I'm going to really quickly go through 2 examples. This is.
Oh, you're good on time.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Keep going. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, so this is on the St. Lawrence River. This is the only natural outlet of all the Great Lakes. So it's an enormous river. We had a field station on an island. The river is 7 miles wide, and right off our island is 100 feet deep. It's an enormous, enormous system. And so we were taking a look at a 30-year data set, and we use experimental gill nets, which means there's different size meshes so that it catches a variety of fish sizes. And so the fish community is dominated by 94% of the fish caught. There's like over 100 species in the river, but 94% of them are northern pike, smallmouth bass, pumpkin seed, yellow perch, white sucker, rock bass, and bullheads. And there were multiple perturbations, right? So this graph of summer water temperature over 30 years actually shows climate change. So each year there's a 4-year cycle of warmer temperatures, cooler temperatures, warmer temperatures, cooler temperatures. And that cycle corresponds to El Nino and La Nina in the tropics, even though we're in the Great Lakes. It's a global pattern. And what we see is although the temperatures increase and decrease in that cycle, the lows are becoming warmer, and the warmer and the highs are becoming warmer, right? There's this gradual increase in both the lows and the highs over time. Now, it's not much. It's like 0.05 degrees per year, but it's measurable and observable over time. So that's one perturbation. And now we'll touch on some chemistry here. Liebig's law of the minimum. What that, when applied to living systems, that basically means that growth or production is limited not by like necessarily energy, but it's by whatever nutrient is scarcest relative to its need, okay? So in easier terms, growth or production is proportional to the availability of the most limiting resource. And so in aquatic systems, it's usually phosphorus. And so evidence of this is 1972 Clean Water Act, which tried to eliminate phosphorus. When you put too much phosphorus in the system, you get this picture up here, the really green algae, and you also often get nuisance algae. And sometimes the combination of phosphorus and nitrogen. When you get so much phosphorus, then nitrogen becomes limiting. You add nitrogen, now phosphorus, but anyway, you can create toxic situations. 1972 Clean Water Act aimed to reduce that, and it was effective. The Great Lakes went from eutrophic to oligotrophic, which means nutrient poor. And you can see the decrease over time. And in about 1992, Doublecrested Cormorants, which were not in the Great Lakes Basin for 100 years prior to that, and were decimated other places because of DDT more recently, but in the early 90s, Doublecrested Cormorants came in and they grew exponentially until they started oiling their eggs to control their populations. The cormorants eat a lot of fish. So what we're talking about is decreased phosphorus, reduced energy entering the food web, which means a shrinking of the food web, right? And then Doublecrested Cormorants taking fish out of the system terrestrially, right? And so again, a constriction of the food web. And here's the yellow line is trends in total fish catch using these experimental gill nets. And the blue line is a 28-year average. Okay, and so what we see is the first half of the time period is above average, second half is largely below. During this time period, we saw zebra and quagga mussels, Dreissena mussels enter, double-crested cormorants come in, round goby and another invasive species, but they end up eating the Dreissenids. So they ended up releasing energy, which brought the food web up a little bit. And total phosphorus declined throughout the time period, right? At the same time, we saw a slight increase in water temperature. And so ecological efficiency, remember, this is the size vector slope. This is the M term, right? This is the y equals mx plus b, the slope. What we see is it wiggles, right? There's some kind of perturbation or natural variation, and you see the slope of that line wiggle, but it's highly consistent. So graphically, it looks like this. And very little difference among these. So we have the two most extreme years and the average. And you see it's a wiggle, right? Because there's variation in fish recruitment, there's variation in the longevity of large older fish, the predators. And so you get a natural wiggle, but it stayed very consistent throughout the whole 30-year time period. Meanwhile, food web capacity, so this is the y-intercept term, right? This gauges the size of the food web. We see a decrease over time. So the pattern's a little different than the fish catch, but it shows the decrease, the constriction of the food web size. From 7.82 down to 6.33, a rather substantial shift. And that increase after 2004 is probably related to the round goby coming in and releasing some of the food sequestered by the Dreissena mussels, but that's a whole different story. A very cool story, but different. Okay, so then to tease apart how the mechanics here, we use principal component analysis that basically takes the different variables, the phosphorus, the temperature, and the cormorants, and combines them into one variable. And we regress that against the size spectra interceptor, the midpoint height. And what we found is a strong negative correlation here. And so while total phosphorus was high and double-crested cormorants were low, the fish community food web size was large. Conversely, when double-crested cormorants were abundant and total phosphorus was low, the food web size was small. So we see top-down from the cormorants eating the fish and bottom-up processes from the lack of primary production due to the phosphorus, operating together to shrink the size of the food web. So in conclusion to this part, the community size structure is highly deterministic. You can see that if you artificially increase one species, it's going to have an effect on the other. That's called community level compensatory responses. But that structure is highly stable and resistant to change. However, the food web capacity varied because of these ecosystem changes, right? External food web changes. Said that. Okay, so this suggests that there's an equilibrium point, and so we can use that for management. Right now, we're just trying to parameterize how the size spectra varies relative to environmental changes and anthropogenic changes. Okay, once we parameterize that, then we can use it for management. So we're in the parameterization phase. Now, importantly, in this example, the core species remain consistent. The relative abundance remain the same. So I'm quickly going to contrast this with a quick example about 5 slides on the Wabash River. The Wabash River is in Indiana. And what we saw here, instead of species, we're going to take a look at functional feeding groups, right? And the things I want to point out early, this is again about a almost a 40-year time series. We have planktivores, which are largely gizzard shad, and omnivores, which eat a wide variety of things. They were the most abundant in the 70s and 80s. But by the time the early 2000s came, they were showed very low composition. Meanwhile, benthic invertebrates, suckers and drums and things like that, went from one of the lowest abundant fishes to dominating the system. So what happened? Actually, rather than what happened, what effect did that have on the size spectra is that question. So again, we use principal component analysis, which took those 4 functional feeding groups and merged them in one variable. What we see is when they transition over the 0, this side of the relationship is, sorry. So we have a principal component which describes a gradient. On one side of the gradient, omnivores, planktivores, and piscivores dominate. And then on the other side of the gradient, benthic invertebrates dominate. And we see a shift in 1993. And we used another procedure called cumulative sum. You might have heard of a rolling average, right? So this takes 3 years and averages them and then drops one, adds the next one to create a rolling average. We did that for each of the functional feeding groups. And where there's an inflection point, change in direction, that's where there was a change in a regime shift, we call it, in the community. So the principal component looking at the whole community says that change happened around 1993. The Q-sum approach found that the planktivores changed direction like 1989, omnivores in 1992, then the benthic invertebrates began to dominate in 1996. So we see the regime shift was slow in unfolding over an 8-year time period. And so that had some significant food web effects. In contrast to St. Lawrence, in food web capacity, the size of the food web, we saw a slight decrease, but not significant or notable, just a slight decrease in the size of the food web. In contrast, right, the ecological efficiency, this is the ratio of large to small, it increased so that there were far more large fish relative to small fish after the regime shift. And this is because it was dominated by large-bodied, low trophic position, right? So we're talking suckers and drum that grow to be large body size, so other things can't eat them. They're just too big to be eaten. They live a long time, but they feed low on the trophic web, so they sequester energy. And so when they dominate, they actually are going to reduce the size of the rest of the food web, but also increase the efficiency. So when benthic invertebrates increased, omnivores decreased, and planktivores decreased exponentially. This shows that community level composition. One species increases or decreases, there has to be a compensatory response among the other species because of the deterministic processes. So we saw 2 different examples. In the St. Lawrence, it was external factors to the food web, and that led to changes in the y-intercept, the size of the food web. Whereas in the Wabash, we saw internal food web changes. There, the food web size stayed the same, but the efficiency changed. And so again, it's like internal processes versus external processes. So this is the last slide. So under this new management framework I'm proposing, right, which is grounded in physics and has connections to chemistry, is focusing on the food web, taking all that complexity that's measured in EcoPath EcoSim using standard monitoring and assessment procedures to develop community size spectra. We evaluate how the ecosystem changes affect the dynamics of that size spectra, the slope and the y-intercept, right? How do things like climate change, changes in precipitation, flow regime, nutrients, invasive species, human fisheries policies, right? How do the land use and land cover changes, how do those systems affect the dynamics of the size spectrum? Once we understand that and we're getting a good handle on that, then we can translate that into the fisheries management paradigm, which is species. Then we can say, how do species fit into the size spectrum? When this species that we want increases, how can we get a decrease out of species we don't want? So I will wrap it up there. I feel like I probably went a little bit long, so I apologize, but I hope everyone enjoyed it and was able to take something away from that.
Am I? Okay. Hi. Oh, no, you're welcome. Thank you so much. Very fascinating. That y-intercept figure, being able to tell so much from that is just, I was muted luckily, but I shouted because I was really excited about it. So a couple of questions. So one question is, do you have any thoughts on how we can increase diversity in environmental science?
Well, okay, so there's no simple way to increase diversity. If we're talking about, let's narrow the scope to like West Virginia, natural biodiversity and say aquatic systems has been hampered a lot by, like forestry practices, mountaintop removals, acid mine drainage, right? We have a lot of impacts here that have hurt sensitive species. So there's a couple steps that are traditionally taken. We clean up the environmental impacts, right? So we try to reforest the watershed, try to, like DEP worked with liming streams to reduce the impact of acid mine drainage. And then we can work within our hatchery systems, right? We have put and take hatcheries, right, which grow trout to put out so people can catch for sport. But then we also have hatcheries that will raise our native species so that we can put them back out into nature to recolonize areas, right? But we need to make sure the environment's able to support them first. And then we can actually move fish from one system to another. We can raise them in hatchery to bring back that native biodiversity.
Awesome. Do you know of any online simulations that teachers can work with their students on to model the relationships between, model relationships within food webs and in the food webs of like sort of fisheries and aquatic areas?
That's a great
And it's okay
question.
if you don't, because we'll look it up on our end if you don't happen to know.
Yeah, well, so I know that the Wisconsin school, if you Google Wisconsin Bioenergetics, they have some software that you can download. So I can tell you, I'm not the sharpest tool in this shed, but I was able to use the manuals and figure that out myself. And they have some tutorials, and I'm sure it's only gotten better since like 20 years ago that I did it. So that would be one, but that's pretty intensive. That'd be great for like an AP bio or something like that, I imagine. I'm not aware of any others, but I'm sure there's a lot around.
Yeah, and I just for anyone who is interested, I have a connection with a aquarium research group. Then I'll ask them because I know they also have a lot of data and resources to see if they have a lead on anything like that. And then I guess so. Another question is, and maybe, well, I guess this is a two-part question. Is how do you tell if a system is like too disrupted to do, this type of an analysis?
Okay, so that's actually pretty simple. So you go out and you catch fish using standard methods with the least bias among body size classes, right? And then you plot it, right? Plot abundance by body size, log transform. And if you see a pattern, the disturbance isn't so severe to disrupt basic ecological processes, right? Their fish, the abundance is our carrying capacity to observe that pattern. And we did some work on Beaver Island, which is in northern Lake Michigan. There's 7 lakes there. We found 3 out of the 7 showed just a shotgun pattern, right? There was no relationship there. Well, they were shallow, and of course the winters there are severe, so they had horrible winter kill. And one of the lakes only had 2 species in it, right? They were not up to carrying capacity. We saw their disturbance level was so high that they didn't use the available energy.
Okay. And then, so I guess, because that brings me to the next question, which is, it's something that people are trying to figuring out, like thinking about coral reefs and figuring out where, like, the ecological decline of coral reefs. And I've heard a number of very interesting theories about what's happening. One of them is actually being that there's an imbalance of bacteria species and a lot of unhealthy bacteria species, which is preventing large predators, like a carrying capacity of large predators. So I guess, is this like, how applicable is this to coral systems? I mean, and I'm thinking too, especially since so much of it's really disrupted already.
Yeah, no, it's really applicable. And actually some of the cutting edge stuff, just in the past, like 10 years ago, there might've been one paper out looking at coral reef, size spectrum coral reefs. I bet if you do the Google search now, you might find 20, 30 or more. That's where the cutting edge is. But coral reefs are extremely complicated because of the spatial linkages, right? Because there's species that use the seagrass beds adjacent to them that use the sand beach communities adjacent. And then a lot of large predators are offshore pelagic, which only come in at night to feed, right? And so your size spectrum is going to vary depending on which components of that you capture. And the other thing that's really important about coral reefs is the functional group composition. So that bacteria and algae issue you were talking about, that's heavily driven by which species are there. There's certain fish that actually do farming that take care of algal beds, right? And they remove all the bad algae. Then there's other fish that trim, like parrotfishes that trim and eat dead corals, allowing for better coral growth. And unfortunately, fishermen end up harvesting those species more than other species. So again, we throw the system out of balance. The best way to restore systems is try to figure out what that balance was or what a new balance might be. Sometimes we can't take it back to the original system. We have to be open-minded, be like, okay, how can we restore a balance, if not the original? And then the system will take care of itself. And I think that needs to be our goal, so that we're not putting energy in. We restore to a place where the system will balance itself.
And I guess, well, then that leads to the question, and this is the last question, I think, but like, how do you, so if you're looking for a new balance, how do you find that?
Ooh, I think that's where the science is at right now. Trying to, so
okay.
Nature's always striving for that balance, right? And that's the laws of thermodynamics, limiting the energy. And just like Darwin said, right, those species are competing to get that energy. So they're independently going to be striving to use all the available energy. So one way or the other, nature's going to find a balance. The big question is, we so dominate the world, is that balance amenable to our needs, right? Is it going to produce fish that we want to eat? Is it going to provide the other ecosystem services that we need? And if not, humans have a tendency to go in and change it, right? And to get what we need out of that ecosystem. So there's a third level to the balance, you know. There's an internal balance, and then it's a human dimension that weighs on the scales. Yeah.
And I should mention to any teachers, if you are interested in learning anything more about coral reefs, let me know, especially about like bacteria and large predators. I have a connection a guy who does a lot of research into that, and another woman who researches coral immunology, and they would be so thrilled to tell you all about their research. So Brent, thank you so very, very much for presenting. I really, really enjoyed it, and I'm really excited to share this with teachers across West Virginia.